Imagine a kingdom, vast and ancient, its cities gleaming like jewels under a desert sun. Its markets pulsed with the rhythm of trade, its scholars penned treatises, and its armies, a force to be reckoned with, stood guard over boundless wealth. This was the Khwarezmian Empire, a power stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River, from the Hindu Kush to the Persian Gulf. For centuries, its rulers had navigated the treacherous currents of Central Asian politics, their authority unquestioned, their might unchallenged. Yet, in the early 13th century, this formidable empire, seemingly invincible, made a fatal miscalculation. It insulted Genghis Khan, and in doing so, it signed its own death warrant. This is the story of how an empire, blinded by arrogance and a misplaced sense of security, brought about its own catastrophic downfall. It is the chilling tale of a diplomatic blunder that ignited a conflagration, a clash of civilizations that reshaped the world, and a ruler who, despite his vast resources, failed to comprehend the true nature of the storm gathering on his eastern horizon. Our story begins not with Genghis Khan, but with the man who stood at the precipice of this empire's destruction. Sultan Muhammad II of Khwarezm. Sultan Muhammad was not a weak man. He was a conqueror in his own right, having expanded his dominion through relentless military campaigns. His court at Garganj was a center of learning and luxury, a testament to his power and the empire's prosperity. But beneath the gilded surface of his reign, a deep-seated insecurity festered. He was a man obsessed with legacy, with proving his might to rivals and subjects alike. He craved recognition, not just as a regional power, but as a dominant force on the world stage. This ambition, coupled with an almost pathological fear of being perceived as weak, would prove to be his ultimate undoing. The first tremors of the coming cataclysm arrived not as a roar, but as a whisper. Mongol traders, laden with furs, silks, and precious metals, began appearing on Khwarezmian borders. They sought peaceful exchange, a new artery of commerce to connect the burgeoning Mongol Empire with the rich markets of the West. Genghis Khan, then establishing his dominion over the steppe, extended a hand of friendship, seeking trade, not conquest. He understood the value of stable borders and prosperous neighbors. He sent envoys, bearing gifts and messages of goodwill, requesting a formal trade agreement. Sultan Muhammad, however, saw not an opportunity, but a challenge. He viewed these nomadic traders, and the distant chieftain who sent them, with disdain. In his eyes, the Mongols were unsophisticated barbarians, hardly worthy of his attention, let alone his respect. The idea of treating them as equals, as partners in trade, was an affront to his imperial dignity. He, the mighty Sultan of Khwarezm, would not lower himself to parley with mere steppe dwellers. This arrogance, this profound misjudgment of Genghis Khan's character and burgeoning power, was the seed of his empire's destruction. The year was 1218. A caravan of 450 Mongol merchants, accompanied by an ambassador from Genghis Khan, arrived at Attur, a Khwarezmian border city. They were unarmed, their intentions purely commercial. Yet, Inalchuk, the governor of Attur and an uncle to Sultan Muhammad, saw not merchants, but spies. Perhaps he was motivated by greed, coveting the vast wealth carried by the caravan. Perhaps he truly believed them to be a threat. Whatever his motive, Inalchuk, without consulting the Sultan, made a decision that would send shockwaves across continents. He seized the caravan, imprisoned the merchants, and then, in an act of unthinkable provocation, executed them all. The ambassador alone was spared, only to be sent back, humiliated and disfigured, to deliver the grim news to Genghis Khan. This act of brutal butchery, this flagrant violation of diplomatic norms, was not merely a crime. It was an insult of the highest order. It was a declaration of war, whether Sultan Muhammad intended it or not. The Mongol Empire, unified under the iron will of Genghis Khan, had been treated with contempt. The consequences would be swift, merciless, and utterly devastating. Sultan Muhammad, by allowing this atrocity to stand, by failing to punish Inalchuk, effectively endorsed the massacre. He underestimated the fury he had unleashed, the relentless vengeance that would soon descend upon his unsuspecting empire. He had drawn the sword against a force he could not comprehend, and his world, and the world itself, would never be the same. The stage was set for a conflict of epic proportions, a cataclysm that would leave a trail of ruin across the heart of Asia, and forever etch the name of Genghis Khan into the annals of history as the ultimate avenger. The biting wind of the steppe carried the scent of dust and distant smoke, a familiar perfume to anyone born under the sprawling, indifferent sky of the Mongol Empire. For Temujin, it was the smell of home, of endless horizons, and the quiet, rhythmic thud of hooves that had defined his existence since childhood. He was not yet the Genghis Khan, the legendary unifier, the world shaker. He was simply Temujin, a man forged in the crucible of hardship, his eyes holding the wisdom of countless sunrises and the memory of too many betrayals. His early life had been a brutal education. Orphaned young, abandoned by his father's tribe, Temujin had known the gnawing hunger of exile, the icy grip of fear, and the raw, desperate fight for survival. He had learned to hunt, to track, to endure, not out of sport, but out of necessity. He had seen the fragile alliances of the steppe dissolve into bloody feuds, the swift rise and brutal fall of petty chieftains. These experiences had etched themselves onto his soul, hardening his resolve and sharpening his intellect. He understood the fickle nature of loyalty, the intoxicating allure of power, and the deep, devastating consequences of weakness. He had built his reputation not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet, unwavering determination. His followers were not conscripted. They were drawn to him, seeing in Temujin a leader unlike any other. He valued merit over lineage, loyalty over kinship. He shared their hardships, fought alongside them, and protected them fiercely. This was the foundation of his growing power, a bond forged in shared adversity and mutual respect. They called him Temujin, and they trusted him with their lives. But the steppe was a vast, chaotic tapestry of warring tribes, each vying for dominance, each clinging to ancient grievances. Peace was a fleeting illusion, a brief pause between skirmishes. Temujin harbored a vision, a radical dream that defied generations of tradition, a unified Mongol nation, bound not by blood feuds, but by a common purpose, a single law. It was a dangerous ambition, one that threatened the established order and challenged the very fabric of their nomadic existence. His most formidable challenge, the one that cast the longest shadow over his burgeoning empire, lay not within the scattered Mongol tribes, but beyond their eastern borders. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, a sprawling, opulent empire, held sway over vast swaths of what was once northern China. They were a civilization of immense wealth, sophisticated cities, and a military machine that dwarfed anything the Mongols could muster. The Jin viewed the nomadic tribes as little more than barbarians, a nuisance to be managed, a source of tribute and cheap labor. Their arrogance was legendary, their disdain palpable. For years, the Jin had exploited the Mongols, demanding tribute, interfering in their internal affairs, and often raiding their lands for slaves and resources. They had a particularly humiliating ritual. Every 3 years, a Jin envoy would arrive on the steppe, demanding that the Mongol chieftains prostrate themselves, offering fealty and gifts. It was a calculated act of subjugation, a constant reminder of the Jin's perceived superiority. Temujin had endured this indignity, as had his father and his grandfather before him. He had watched the faces of his people, etched with a mixture of resentment and resignation, as they bowed before the Jin emissaries. But the last visit had been different. The Jin envoy, a corpulent man named Wanyan Yongji, had not merely demanded tribute. He had gone further, his words dripping with contempt, publicly humiliating several Mongol chieftains, including one of Temujin's most trusted allies. He had spoken of the Mongols as dogs of the steppe, fit only for servitude, their customs primitive, their aspirations laughable. He had even scoffed at Temujin's growing influence, dismissing him as a mere upstart. The insult had cut deep, not just for Temujin, but for every Mongol who witnessed it. It was a deliberate act of provocation, a blatant disregard for their honor. Temujin had stood silent, his face a mask of stone, but inside, a cold fury had begun to simmer. The memory of Yongji's sneering face, his dismissive wave of the hand, played on an endless loop in Temujin's mind. It was more than just an affront. It was a challenge, a declaration of war on their very dignity. This was the central conflict that now consumed Temujin. The crushing weight of Jin dominance, the constant humiliation, and the burning desire to reclaim the honor of his people. He knew that to truly unite the Mongols, he needed to give them a common enemy, a shared grievance that transcended tribal loyalties. The Jin dynasty, with its boundless arrogance and its history of oppression, was that enemy. The path ahead was fraught with peril, a monumental undertaking that would demand every ounce of his cunning, his strength, and his unwavering will. Temujin knew this would be a long, brutal struggle, but the alternative, continued subjugation, was unthinkable. He would not allow his people to remain dogs of the steppe. He would make them masters. His leadership was not born of inherited right, but forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual respect. He had fought alongside them, bled with them, and celebrated their victories as his own. This bond, deeper than any tribal allegiance, was the bedrock upon which Temujin began to build something new, something unprecedented. He envisioned a unified people, not scattered tribes forever warring amongst themselves, but a single, unstoppable force under one banner. It was an audacious dream, a whisper of a future that seemed impossible in the fragmented, brutal reality of the steppe. The first step in this monumental task was to secure his own position, to silence the whispers of doubt and the shouts of defiance. Temujin knew that true power did not come from conquest alone, but from the unwavering loyalty of those who followed. He began by consolidating his influence among the smaller, more vulnerable clans, offering them protection in exchange for their allegiance. He demonstrated his unwavering commitment to justice, punishing those who betrayed his trust swiftly and decisively, but also rewarding loyalty with generosity. Word of his fairness, his strategic brilliance, and his unyielding will spread across the grasslands like wildfire. More and more, the dispossessed, the downtrodden, and the ambitious sought him out, drawn by the promise of order in a chaotic world. Yet, this nascent unity was fragile, constantly threatened by the entrenched power of the older, larger tribes. They viewed Temujin's growing influence with suspicion, seeing him not as a unifier, but as a dangerous upstart challenging their ancient prerogatives. They mocked his humble origins, scoffed at his vision of a unified nation, and dismissed his followers as a band of outcasts. These established chieftains, steeped in generations of intertribal feuds, clung fiercely to their independence, their pride blinding them to the rising tide that Temujin represented. They believed their traditions, their numbers, and their entrenched power would easily crush this ambitious newcomer. One chieftain, in particular, stood as a towering obstacle: Jamuka, Temujin's former blood brother. Their bond had once been as strong as any kinship, a testament to shared youth and mutual respect. But as Temujin's star ascended, Jamuka's resentment festered. He saw Temujin's ambition not as a noble quest for unity, but as a personal affront, a betrayal of their shared past. Jamuka, a charismatic and skilled warrior in his own right, rallied many of the conservative tribes, those who feared change and clung to the old ways. He accused Temujin of tyranny, of seeking to enslave free peoples under a single, iron fist. The stage was set for an inevitable clash, not just between two men, but between two competing visions for the future of the steppe. Temujin understood the gravity of this impending conflict. Jamuka commanded a formidable force, composed of seasoned warriors who believed in the ancient tribal order. Their numbers were impressive, their experience vast. A direct confrontation would be a brutal, bloody affair, risking everything Temujin had painstakingly built. He could not afford a defeat. A single misstep could shatter his nascent confederation and send his followers scattering back into the winds of the steppe. The stakes were impossibly high. This was not merely a battle for territory or resources. It was a struggle for the very soul of the Mongol people. He spent countless nights under the vast, star-strewn sky, meticulously planning, weighing every possible outcome. Temujin knew that conventional warfare might not be enough. He needed to outmaneuver, outthink, and outlast his opponents. He had to demonstrate not just his military prowess, but his superior understanding of the human heart, his ability to inspire loyalty and expose the weaknesses of his enemies. The path to unification was fraught with peril, a treacherous journey across a landscape of betrayal, ambition, and ancient grudges. But Temujin, tempered by a lifetime of hardship, was ready to face it all. He would not yield. He would not break. He would forge his empire, no matter the cost. His resolve hardened with each passing day, fueled by the memory of past injustices and the burning vision of a unified future. The winds of change were gathering, and Temujin stood at their epicenter, ready to ride the storm. The empire Temujin envisioned was not merely a collection of scattered tribes. It was a single, indomitable entity, bound by laws, loyalty, and a shared destiny. He understood that true power lay not in ephemeral victories, but in enduring institutions. The chaos he had witnessed, the constant betrayals and internecine wars, had taught him the bitter truth. A people divided would always fall. His early experiences, the gnawing hunger and the cold fear of abandonment, had forged in him an unshakable conviction. He would not allow his people to suffer such fragmentation ever again. Temujin began to lay the foundations of this new order, piece by painstaking piece. He abolished the old tribal distinctions that had fueled so much animosity, replacing them with a system based on merit and direct allegiance to the Khan. He dismantled the traditional aristocratic privileges, elevating commoners who displayed skill and courage. This radical restructuring met with fierce resistance from those who clung to their inherited power. But Temujin was unyielding. He had seen too many promising alliances crumble under the weight of petty jealousies and ancient feuds. His empire would be built on a different bedrock. He established a strict legal code, the Yasa, which applied equally to all, from the humblest herdsman to the highest general. This was a revolutionary concept in a world accustomed to arbitrary rule and the whims of local chieftains. The Yasa codified everything from military discipline to property rights, but its core tenets were simple: absolute loyalty to Temujin, unwavering obedience to the law, and swift, uncompromising justice for transgressors. Theft, treason, and cowardice were met with the harshest penalties, often death. This severity was not born of cruelty, but of necessity. To forge a unified nation from disparate, often warring factions required an iron will and an unyielding commitment to order. Word of Temujin's reforms and his growing strength spread across the steppe, carried by traders and terrified refugees. Some chieftains, recognizing the inevitable, swore fealty, bringing their warriors and their lands into his burgeoning domain. Others, steeped in generations of independence and contempt for any authority beyond their own, scoffed at the idea of a single ruler. They saw Temujin not as a unifier, but as an upstart, a threat to their ancient ways. These were the ones who would test his resolve, who would force his hand. The conflicts that followed were brutal, often protracted. Temujin led his armies with a tactical brilliance born of intuition and hard-won experience. He employed feints and encirclements, psychological warfare, and lightning-fast cavalry charges. His campaigns were not just about conquest. They were about assimilation. When a tribe was defeated, its warriors were often integrated into his own forces, their leaders given positions of responsibility if they proved loyal. This policy, radical for its time, swelled his ranks with hardened fighters, and turned former enemies into dedicated allies. Yet, even as his empire expanded, Temujin faced constant challenges from within and without. Assassination attempts were frequent, betrayals a recurring nightmare. He learned to trust few, but those he did, he trusted implicitly. His inner circle, men like Subutai and Jebe, were not chosen for their lineage, but for their unwavering loyalty and unparalleled military prowess. They were extensions of his will, instruments of his grand design. The vastness of the steppe, once a symbol of freedom, now became a canvas for his ambition. From the icy winds of Siberia to the sun-baked plains of the Gobi, Temujin's influence grew, slowly but inexorably. Each victory, each new alliance, each law enacted, was another thread woven into the tapestry of his empire. The vision that had once seemed an impossible dream was taking shape, forged in the crucible of conflict and tempered by an unshakable will. He was building something new, something unprecedented, and the world would soon feel its weight. The empire Temujin had meticulously built, brick by bloody brick, was now a juggernaut. Its reach stretched from the frozen taiga to the sun-baked deserts, its name whispered in awe and terror across countless lands. Yet, even as his dominion expanded, Temujin understood that true power lay not just in conquest, but in control, in the systematic organization of his vast domains. He had established a legal code, the Yasa, a framework of laws that brought order to a world accustomed to chaos. He had created a postal system, the Yam, its network of swift riders ensuring his commands reached the farthest corners of his empire with unprecedented speed. His army, once a ragtag band of steppe warriors, had been transformed into an unyielding force, its discipline and tactical brilliance unmatched. But even the most formidable empire faced challenges, and for Temujin, the greatest threat often came not from external enemies, but from the insidious whispers of hubris, the arrogance of those who failed to grasp the true nature of power. His gaze, often distant and contemplative, now carried a sharper edge, a subtle warning of the storm brewing on the horizon. His reputation, forged in battle and solidified by victory, preceded him everywhere. Kings trembled at the mere mention of his name, and entire cities surrendered without a fight rather than face the wrath of his legions. This widespread fear, however, bred a dangerous complacency in some, a foolish belief that their own power or distance would shield them from his reach. It was a fatal miscalculation, one that Temujin had seen played out countless times. He had witnessed the rise and fall of many who believed themselves untouchable, only to be crushed under the relentless hooves of his cavalry. He was not merely a conqueror. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable tide that swept away all who dared to stand in its path. His attention, honed by years of strategic thinking, turned westward, towards a rich and ancient empire that had, until now, largely ignored the rumblings from the east. The Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling dominion of wealth and culture, sat astride the Silk Road, its cities glittering with untold riches. Their Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, ruled with an iron fist, his armies vast, his pride even vaster. He saw himself as a grand emperor, a successor to the ancient Persian kings, and viewed the Mongols as mere barbarians, a temporary nuisance on the rings of his civilized world. Temujin, ever the pragmatist, sought trade, not immediate conquest. He understood the mutual benefits of commerce, the way it could bind disparate peoples together, even those who were once enemies. He dispatched a caravan of merchants, laden with precious goods, a diplomatic gesture intended to open lines of communication, to establish a peaceful relationship. It was a test, a probe into the character of the Khwarezmian Shah, a subtle invitation to join the vast network of his burgeoning empire. But the Shah, blinded by his own arrogance, saw only an opportunity for plunder, a chance to assert his perceived superiority. At the city of Atar, the Khwarezmian governor, Inalchuk, acting on the Shah's implicit approval, seized the caravan. The merchants were robbed, their goods confiscated, and many were brutally executed. It was an act of egregious contempt, a direct insult to Temujin, a challenge flung across the vast expanse of the steppe. News of the massacre reached Temujin swiftly, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape the slaughter. A cold fury, slow and deliberate, began to simmer within him. He had offered peace, extended a hand of friendship, and in return, his envoys had been murdered, their trust betrayed. This was not merely an act of brigandage. It was an affront to his honor, an insult to the very principles upon which he had built his empire. Still, Temujin, ever mindful of the immense logistical challenge of a full-scale invasion, offered the Shah one last chance at reconciliation. He sent a small delegation, 3 envoys, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, to demand justice for the murdered merchants and the return of the stolen goods. It was a final test, a desperate hope that reason might prevail over pride. The Shah's response was not merely dismissive. It was an act of unimaginable barbarity. He ordered the Muslim envoy beheaded and the 2 Mongol envoys' beards burned off before sending them back to Temujin, a clear message of utter disdain and defiance. This act, more than any other, sealed the fate of the Khwarezmian Empire. It was an insult so profound, so deliberate that it transcended mere politics. It was a personal affront to Temujin, a direct challenge to his authority, his reputation, and his very being. The winds of the steppe, once carrying the scent of home, now carried the scent of vengeance. Temujin, who had united a fragmented people, who had built an empire on the principles of discipline and loyalty, felt the ancient, primal urge for retribution surge through him. The Shah had not only insulted him, he had insulted the entire Mongol nation, spitting on their customs, their honor, their very existence. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for conquest had begun. The approaching storm was no longer brewing. It was gathering its full, destructive force. The Mongol war machine, once a distant rumor, became a terrifying reality for the Khwarezmian Empire. Temujin, his eyes burning with the cold fire of retribution, unleashed his armies. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a reckoning, a brutal, undeniable response to the Shah's arrogance. The cities that had once boasted of their impregnable walls and vast wealth now faced an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. Temujin's strategy was swift, merciless, and utterly overwhelming. He divided his forces, striking simultaneously at multiple points, preventing any coordinated defense. His generals, men forged in the same crucible of hardship as Temujin himself, executed his commands with ruthless efficiency. They moved with astonishing speed, covering vast distances across the desert, appearing as if from nowhere to besiege unsuspecting strongholds. The Mongols did not merely attack. They engulfed. They did not just conquer. They annihilated. Otrar, the city where Temujin's envoys had been murdered, was the first to feel the full weight of his wrath. Its governor, Inalchuk, the man directly responsible for the insult, found his defiance crumbling against an unstoppable tide. The siege was long and brutal, a testament to the Mongols' grim determination. When the city finally fell, Temujin ensured that the punishment fit the crime. Inalchuk was captured, and in a gruesome act of poetic justice, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a grim mirroring of the wealth he had coveted and the messages he had refused to hear. The city itself was razed, its inhabitants put to the sword, a chilling warning to any who dared to defy Temujin. From Otrar, the Mongol tide swept across the Khwarezmian heartland. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench one by one, the jewels of the empire fell. Temujin was not just a warrior. He was a master of psychological warfare. He used terror as a weapon, spreading tales of his armies' ferocity, encouraging surrender through fear. Those who resisted faced total destruction. Those who submitted were often spared, their skills and resources absorbed into the burgeoning Mongol Empire. This calculated brutality was a deliberate tactic, designed to break the will of the enemy before the final blow was struck. The Shah, Mohammed II, the architect of this disastrous confrontation, fled in panic. He abandoned his cities, his people, and his empire, a king reduced to a desperate fugitive. Temujin, however, was not content to merely conquer his lands. He wanted the Shah himself. He dispatched a special detachment, led by his most skilled generals, Jib and Subutai, to hunt him down. This pursuit was relentless, a symbol of Temujin's unwavering resolve. The Shah, once so arrogant, died a lonely, pathetic death on a small island in the Caspian Sea, a stark contrast to the vast empire he had once commanded. His demise marked not just the end of a man, but the definitive end of the Khwarezmian Empire. The conflict, which had begun with a diplomatic slight, ended with the complete obliteration of a powerful civilization. Temujin had not GHT this war. It had been thrust upon him. But once engaged, he prosecuted it with an unyielding ferocity that left no doubt as to the consequences of insulting the Mongol nation. His actions reshaped the map of the world, demonstrating that the steppes, once seen as the barbaric fringes, were now the center of an unstoppable force. The empire that had dared to insult Temujin had ceased to exist, a stark and permanent monument to the cost of hubris. The vast wealth of Khwarezm, its skilled artisans, its strategic locations, all now belonged to Temujin, further fueling the expansion of his burgeoning empire. The message was clear, etched in blood and dust across the shattered cities of Central Asia. Defy Temujin, defy the Mongols, and face utter annihilation. The destruction of Khwarezm was not merely a military victory. It was a brutal, undeniable declaration. Temujin had made his point with the very foundations of cities, with the lives of those who had dared to insult his envoys, his very person. The message, carried by the wind and the terrified whispers of refugees, echoed across the known world. The Mongol Empire was not to be trifled with. Its wrath was absolute, its vengeance swift and merciless. Yet, even as the last embers of Khwarezm's grandeur faded into dust, Temujin understood that true power lay not just in destruction, but in the establishment of a new order. He had shattered the old world. Now he had to forge the new. His campaigns had stretched his empire to unprecedented lengths, from the eastern steppes to the western reaches of Persia. Governing such a vast and diverse realm required more than just the might of the sword. It demanded a system, a law, a unity that transcended tribal loyalties. Temujin, the boy who had once known hunger and abandonment, now stood as the architect of an empire. He implemented the Yasa, a comprehensive legal code that would govern every aspect of Mongol life, from military discipline to property rights. It was a radical concept for its time, designed to foster unity and order among disparate peoples. He established a postal relay system, the Yam, which allowed messages and goods to travel at incredible speeds across his vast dominion, binding the distant corners of the empire together. He fostered trade, understanding that prosperity was as crucial as conquest for long-term stability. The very structure of his army reflected this new vision. Loyalty was paramount, merit the only path to advancement. No longer would a man's birth determine his worth. His skill and dedication to the empire were all that mattered. This meritocracy drew in talented individuals from across his conquered lands, integrating them into the Mongol system, turning former enemies into loyal subjects. Temujin was not just a conqueror. He was a revolutionary, dismantling old hierarchies and building a society based on a brutal, yet effective, form of equality under his supreme rule. His personal transformation mirrored that of his empire. The raw, desperate survivor of the steppes had evolved into the sagacious statesman, the strategic mastermind. The fury that had driven him to avenge the insult of Khwarezm had matured into a cold, calculated resolve to secure his legacy, to ensure that the Mongol nation he had forged would endure. Temujin had learned that true leadership was not about endless war, but about building something that would outlast the clang of swords and the cries of battle. He understood that his own mortality was the ultimate frontier. He had brought the Mongol tribes together, unified them under one banner, and expanded their reach beyond imagination. His final years were spent consolidating power, refining his laws, and preparing his successors. He had seen too many empires crumble from within, too many legacies dissolve into infighting and chaos. Temujin was determined that his would not be one of them. The empire he had built, born from the dust of the steppe and forged in the fires of conquest, was a testament to his indomitable will. The insult that had sparked the annihilation of Khwarezm had, ironically, become a catalyst for the greatest expansion of his power, forcing Temujin to look beyond mere vengeance and towards the construction of a lasting dominion. He had taken an affront and turned it into the cornerstone of an empire that would forever be etched into the annals of history. The boy Temujin, the man Temujin, had become the legend, and the world would never be the same. The wind, once a biting enemy across the steppes, now felt like a familiar companion, whispering tales of conquest and consequence. Temujin, no longer just a chieftain, stood upon the blood-soaked earth, the remnants of the Khwarezmian Empire crumbling at his feet. His eyes, once burning with a singular, consuming rage, now held a cold, calculating satisfaction. The insult, the murder of his envoys, the defiant beheading of his emissary, these acts had ignited a fire that had consumed an entire civilization. He had promised retribution, a vengeance so complete it would echo through the ages, and he had delivered. City after city had fallen, their defenses shattered, their populations scattered or enslaved. Samarkand, Urgench, Merva, names that once symbolized the pinnacle of Islamic scholarship and trade, now stood as desolate monuments to his wrath. The Shah, Muhammad II, had died a pathetic, hunted figure on a desolate island in the Caspian, his empire reduced to dust, his legacy a cautionary tale. This was not merely a victory. It was an annihilation, a brutal testament to the cost of defying the burgeoning Mongol power. Temujin had set out to teach a lesson, not just to Khwarezm, but to every kingdom, every sultanate, every distant land that might ever contemplate disrespecting his word. The message was clear, etched in fire and blood across the vast expanse of Asia. Challenge the Mongols at your peril. Yet, this absolute triumph came at a price. The man who had unified the disparate Mongol tribes, who had dreamed of a world united under a single sky, had also unleashed a force of unimaginable destruction. The swift, merciless efficiency of his armies had left scars that would not heal for centuries. The vibrant cultures, the intricate trade routes, the accumulated knowledge of generations, much of it lay in ruins, swept away by the relentless tide of his ambition. Temujin, now known to the world as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, understood this cost. He had not sought destruction for its own sake, but as a necessary instrument to forge his empire, to ensure its security, to solidify his authority. He had learned that true power was not just about conquering. It was about instilling an unshakable fear, a profound respect that transcended mere military might. The Khwarezmian campaign had been the ultimate demonstration of this principle. His journey from a hunted outcast to the undisputed master of vast swaths of the known world had transformed him. The raw, desperate fury of his youth had matured into a strategic, almost detached ruthlessness. He had learned that emotions, while powerful motivators, had to be harnessed, directed, and ultimately transcended in the pursuit of a grander vision. He was no longer just Temujin, the wronged man seeking justice. He was Genghis Khan, the architect of an empire, a force of nature. Looking out across the ravaged landscape, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. The roar of battle had faded, replaced by the mournful wind. The immediate conflict was resolved, the insult avenged, the empire shattered. But the path ahead remained vast, filled with new challenges, new peoples to bring into his fold, new systems to establish. The conquest of Khwarezm was not an end, but a brutal, unforgettable chapter in the ongoing saga of the Mongol Empire. The world had changed, irrevocably, because one man had dared to challenge the nascent power of Temujin, and in doing so, had paved the way for an empire that would forever alter the course of history. The sheer scale of the Khwarezmian devastation was almost incomprehensible. Entire cities, once thriving centers of commerce and culture, were reduced to mounds of rubble and dust, their populations either massacred or enslaved, their libraries burned, their irrigation systems destroyed. This wasn't just conquest. It was an act of deliberate, strategic annihilation, designed to send an unmistakable message. The Mongol forces, under the brilliant command of Subutai and Jebe, had swept through the region like a plague, leaving behind a wasteland. The fertile plains of Transoxiana, once the breadbasket of Central Asia, lay fallow, its canals choked with debris, its fields barren. The Silk Road, the very artery of global trade, was severed, its caravans replaced by columns of Mongol cavalry. The economic and cultural impact of this cataclysm would reverberate for centuries, altering the demographic and political landscape of the entire region. Yet, amidst the ashes, Temujin saw not just destruction, but opportunity. The vast wealth plundered from Khwarezmian cities, the skilled artisans and engineers spared from the slaughter, the strategic locations now under his control, all served to further fuel the expansion of his burgeoning empire. He was a pragmatist above all else, capable of immense brutality, but also possessing a keen understanding of what it took to build and sustain a lasting dominion. The Khwarezmian campaign, though born of vengeance, ultimately served to consolidate his power and provide the resources necessary for future conquests. The campaign also served as a brutal training ground for his generals and a proving ground for his military innovations. The siege warfare employed against fortified cities like Urgench, the elaborate feints and flanking maneuvers, the use of captured engineers, and their knowledge of siege engines all refined the Mongol war machine into an even more formidable instrument of conquest. Temujin himself, though not always at the front lines, directed the overall strategy with an almost superhuman foresight, anticipating his enemies' moves, exploiting their weaknesses, and adapting his tactics to every new challenge. He was a master chess player, and the world was his board. The psychological impact of the Khwarezmian campaign was perhaps even more profound than the physical destruction. The tales of Mongol ferocity, often exaggerated by terrified survivors, spread like wildfire, preceding their armies and often causing cities to surrender without a fight. The Mongols had perfected the art of psychological warfare, using terror as a weapon to break the enemy's will before the first arrow was even loosed. This reputation, forged in the fires of Khwarezm, would serve them well in their future campaigns, as kingdoms across Eurasia chose submission over annihilation. The destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire also had significant geopolitical consequences. It removed a major power from the Central Asian landscape, creating a vacuum that the Mongols were quick to fill. It opened up new routes to the west, paving the way for future Mongol incursions into Russia and Europe. The world, once a collection of disparate, often isolated empires, was now becoming interconnected in a way it had never been before, albeit through the brutal force of Mongol conquest. Temujin, the man who had once been a hunted outcast, now stood as the undisputed master of a vast and growing empire. He had avenged the insult, shattered his enemy, and in doing so, had transformed himself from a regional chieftain into a global force. The Khwarezmian campaign was a turning point, not just for the Mongols, but for the entire world. It marked the definitive arrival of a new, terrifying power on the global stage, a power that would reshape continents, alter the course of history, and leave an indelible mark on the human story. The echoes of Khwarezm's fall would resonate for generations, a grim reminder of the cost of hubris and the unstoppable force of the Mongol war machine.